In the UK at the moment, there's been a lot of controversy about the government's decision to cut, not completely cut, but slightly cut back the feed-in tariffs, which the solar industry there are very annoyed about. But many say it's still a very expensive technology and it's not always guaranteed to work. When it's cloudy, it doesn't always produce the results. How effective really is solar energy?
Well, it can be really effective. I think you're actually asking a couple of different questions, or actually you didn't ask a question, you made a statement. There are a few elements. So what the UK did, or is in the process of doing, is illustrative for what is happening in the solar sector, and by the way, possibly in other sectors, which is to initiate a policy. Because let's face it, we're not in a situation of sustainable markets yet. You have to have a good technology, and the technology is good and it's getting better. They're getting more efficient. You don't need, in situations of less sunlight, it will also produce electricity, less than in other parts of the world. But what you really need is to get to that sustainable market is you need policies that are going to best stimulate that. Now, how you design those policies is really important. You really need to ask yourselves questions about, well, what is the situation in this country? And therefore, one policy instrument may work in one country but not in another. But what is very important overall is that the policy is clear, that it has clear targets, that there is a long-term visibility, which obviously is not the case with many of the policies in Europe, where it's what we call stop and go. You introduce a policy and before it can even almost start working, it's been stopped again or it's been cut. And that is really a nightmare, just going to say it like that, from an investor point of view, because what you really need is bringing costs down. You have to scale up. You have to apply, and for that you need investors. You need people who want to invest in this. They're not going to invest if you change the policy and the financing schemes from one day to the next. So in other words, long-term visibility is very important.
And you talk about scaling up. There are plenty of big projects that have been mooted, particularly the Desertec project in Northern Africa. What parts of the world do you really see solar playing a huge part in the time to come?
Well, what we have seen in solar PV is that it has been the largest in some of the European markets. So right now the market share of the total PV solar market is largest in Europe. But we are seeing that the share of Europe of a market that will be much bigger is coming down. The rest of the world is going up, and then the countries that you see growing are China, India. India is actually expected to triple between 2011 and 2014. So we're really seeing that in the overall market share you can see that countries that were not the traditional PV solar countries are actually picking up. And what we've seen is that in the European countries there have been schemes like the feed-in tariff, and what you see now is we're going from sort of subsidized markets to transition markets to sustainable markets, which is really where we're talking about solar PV being competitive. And one example of where that is already the case is when you look at India. In India, it's not only about addressing climate change and reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's also about new power that will be needed. We still have 2 billion people around the world that do not have access to energy. In India, the efficiency is 10 to 15%. There's a lot of diesel generators that are being used that are very costly. And really the cost of our technology is already lower than that. So there we are already competitive in a certain application.
In the long run, is it more effective to have huge solar farms, or is it more effective to work on the microgeneration level, so each house has a few solar panels to look after its own needs?
Well, it's probably both. Probably you need both. It really depends. Again, what is very important though to say is that large-scale solar is very important to bring the costs further down, because there you can really get the economies of scale going, and that's where you get the cost reductions potential. Now, at the same time, you also need rooftop as we call it, micro generation. Depending on where you are you grid connected, not grid connected? You really need a combination of both. So the distributed solar power as well as ground mounted solar parks.